I just want to say a few things about a policy symposium I co-organized with Suzanne Hinmarch, who's not here, but some folks who were here today were at that meeting in Ottawa. It was called Wither the Welfare State, Implications for HIV Politics and Policy, and it was really informed and motivated by a desire to talk about welfare, to talk about the welfare state, and link this up with neoliberalism. So as I was listening to Gary, I was just basically slashing my presentation because he hit on a lot of the points. But the talking about the state, or talking about the welfare state, is, I think, obviously incomplete without an explicit nod to understanding our colonial past and our colonial present. We say that, we have to say it, we have to repeat it, because it really does inform how we understand HIV. I want to just basically say a little bit more about what we were trying to focus on in the symposium and what is sort of coming after. We're now in the process of working on a book that is coming out of the kind of collective discussions that happened last year, bringing together community folks, more academic kind of presentations, as well as some policy folks. And it is interesting, I think Gary sort of did raise this as well. We haven't really paid much attention to the role of social welfare. We haven't really talked about how a robust welfare state really prevents the circumstances that make individuals vulnerable to HIV. And I've been trying to think about that over the last couple of weeks. We identified sort of 5 areas of interest. It's not an exhaustive list, but we wanted to talk about HIV and disability. At a conference recently at Carleton University, we were reflecting on how there's really a lack of cross-disability organizing and HIV folks. There's a lot of common issues and a lot of interesting radical disability organizing going on, but it seems that they're happening along parallel tracks. We identified integration, obviously, as an issue, immigrant refugee health, indigenous health, and aging and long-term care. I'm not going to be able to talk about all of them here. Obviously, the question about integration and the so-called end of exceptionalism is something that was sort of running through a lot of the discussion that happened. We don't understand these policy areas as mutually exclusive, of course. We know that they don't sort of cover all the ground that we wanted to cover, but it was really trying to sort of at least focus our discussion for that period of time. But I'm pleased that we're going to be moving forward with the project, but I'm also at the same time in the process of getting this going, was very disappointed with how little people who talk about and think about and write about the welfare state have paid little attention to HIV as well. That lack is noticeable. We're not, if anybody wants to hear more about the project, I can talk about that as well after. But a little bit about the title and where that was coming from. We use wither, the welfare state, to sort of indicate or ask the question of whether the state is sort of withering away, shriveling, fading, decaying, but also asking where the heck is the welfare state, as in wither with an H. And I think, I think we'll talk about that a little bit more, but it's clear that the state is not sort of withering away. We can talk about state services being cut back significantly, but we have to talk about the state being really present in our lives, and especially in the lives of positive people. We referenced the criminalization discussion for sure. So there's there's lots of examples of welfare state retrenchment people talk about, programs, services, and it's important to direct our attention to them. But there's also evidence that the welfare state as we know it is being repurposed, reshaped, remolded, and I think we want to focus, that was part of what we were motivated as well by with this project, that focusing solely on sort of challenging the austerity agenda, which we must do, which we can and should do, is not sufficient. To suggest, for instance, that the net effect of all of this is a welfare state that's a shadow of its former self, accurate, yes, strategically important point to make, yes, oh my God, okay. But it would overstate, I think, and I think it would also underestimate the shift. Something more significant is going on. So I think there is a sense in which I'm more of a glass is half empty kind of person, so I'm also trying to focus my own attention on moving away from a kind of doom and gloom that is the way we can talk, that it's fairly easy to talk about in this case. So alongside this necessary political work, that is necessary to kind of sustain a community-based response to HIV, that's critical of austerity measures. I think we need to expand our focus to this bigger picture. And that means destabilizing, disturbing, unsettling how we talk about the state as a unitary actor. I mean, I think a lot of people on the other side of from looking at the state are quite content to sort of see the state as a unitary actor, while we recognize that the outside, that non-state or community sector is something we know. And I think it's great to see people like, I mean, Adrian's here somewhere, Adrian Gouda and others forcing us also to challenge the received wisdom about what constitutes the community in community-based research. And I think we also need to be mindful of that when we think about the state. There's no, obviously for sure, cataclysmic event that's overturned the world of HIV policy making. We know the real world is incremental. Policy doesn't proceed in neat linear steps. Lots of people I talk to who ask questions about policy cling to this sort of model of policy making that sort of proceeds in nice little stages, and we in a fairly linear fashion. We know policy moves in fits and starts. We know policies are proposed for problems that are poorly defined. It's the direct result of, it's the result of direct action from the outside, from community-based folks, of course, but it also consists in small decisions taken at particularly critical key moments, decisions that can have ripple effects, decisions that can open up opportunities, I'm sounding like a policy wonk, and kind of close opportunities. Political scientists, I'm a political scientist, always talk about how politics produces policies, and I think we all that's a kind of bedtime story we like to tell ourselves. It's a good story. But the inverse is true. Policies produce politics. And policies that are put in place today can leave this kind of lasting mark. It's important to think about that in the context of integration. And I think we can see that in positive ways, we can see that in negative ways. People use the term path dependency to capture this, sort of saying that, I'm not going to bore you with the details, but basically it means that policy decisions you put in place today structure the kinds of things you can imagine as solutions tomorrow. And so that, part of the message from that kind of idea is that we have really crappy policies, and they're largely a result of what we did, and then they're difficult to undo. So. The other thing I want to sort of talk about is how policy, we need to challenge how we talk about policy. I sort of mentioned a little bit about that. There's the obvious stuff around the agenda for integration, but, and Gary sort of touched on this because he sort of touched on everything. How do we account for the strategic mobilization of what some people call ignorance, strategic mobilization of ignorance? The attempt to keep issues off the agenda. This is significant. Lindsay McGooey, a sociologist who doesn't write about HIV, has argued, quote, "We need less attention to the politics of knowledge and more to the politics of ignorance, to the mobilization of ambiguity, the denial of unsettling facts, the realization that knowing the least amount possible is often the most indispensable tool for managing risks and exonerating oneself from blame." I don't know where to begin with an agenda for that, but I think we are focused, and there's a good historical reason why we focus on knowledge mobilization, expertise. Stephen Epstein's sort of work around, democratic science and how AIDS activists really kind of blurred this distinction between science and civil society. I don't know if we're prepared for that part of the discussion. The idea that it's not knowledge so much as non-knowledge. It's the stuff we don't see necessarily, the stuff we can't observe. 5 minutes? I was going to talk about neoliberalism in 5 minutes. Okay, maybe I won't. Briefly, I think a good way of thinking about neoliberalism for me comes out of, it's not my own idea. Wendy Larner talks about neoliberalism as an ideology, as a policy, and as a governmentality. Where are the Foucauldians sort of listening there? I don't want to say much about all of them, except that I don't think that's an academic discussion either. I think when we start to think about how we understand neoliberalism, and Larner sort of says this, those interpretations of neoliberalism have different implications for understanding the restructuring of the welfare state, and the kinds of strategies that we might advance to sort of further social justice. It sounds like an academic discussion, but when we think about neoliberalism as a governmentality, which is another way of saying that neoliberalism kind of moves in ways that power, for instance, people are governed in a way, should I say, at a distance. It's not the kind of brute power of the state so much as the ways in which it produces productive, active citizens, us, subjects. I think that opens up a different kind of discussion that we can sort of even imagine the role of community organizations in ways that challenge our notion of empowerment that has been sort of fundamental to thinking about community organizations and community activism. And Barbara Cruikshank wrote a book a long time ago that essentially said, that even the discourse of empowerment is really kind of traverses ideological grounds because it appeals to people on the left and the right. But we seem to kind of, again, are comforted by the idea that empowerment is something that is the heart of social justice activism. So, 6 pages later, I just want to conclude. I have a few minutes, I think, to conclude. What I hope is we can think about the debates that surround integration and austerity within a framework that's not ignorant of welfare and not ignorant of the welfare state. People who study health policy, sort of one of my areas of research, don't neglect the state. If anything, they're accused of being obsessed with talking about the state. Is this because the history of AIDS activism was formed in the wake of state neglect, silence, as sort of Gary was referencing with the Jacob remark? Yes, of course it has something to do with it, but willing away the state won't make it go away. Thinking about state power as residing somewhere out there is out of touch with the ways in which state power moves in here and through us, especially how state power acts on positive bodies. We know that through the non-disclosure stuff. So I don't know why we're reluctant to talk about the welfare state in the context of this epidemic, but I think we need to do ourselves a favor and really talk about state power in some way as more contradictory, in the sense that, the contradictions of an increasingly exceptional criminal response, which was referenced earlier to the epidemic, while we traffic in the language of integration. That is the fundamental contradiction we're kind of forced to counter. We can imagine a critical engaged response without necessarily subscribing to grand theories about being co-opted or swallowed up by the state. I mean, Brayside and Lindquist said this more than 20 years ago. We could do well to avoid making blanket generalizations or totalizing narratives about this changing context and how it's shaping state responses. Just as the communities affected by HIV/AIDS are diverse and multifaceted, so is the state we must confront. 2 minutes. Done. Thank you.